Hello, everyone. Thank you very much for letting me speak today. I am a researcher at the Vienna Institute of Demography. I'm also a doctoral student at the University of Vienna. And today I want to present some research I'm doing where I'm looking at the effect of joblessness and the perception of future instabilities effect on the entry into parenthood. So just looking a little bit at the background, uncertainty is certainly part of the human condition, but employment uncertainty and our experience with employment uncertainty has changed in the last few decades. Employment uncertainty is largely defined by globalization and the increase in both instability and inequality. By this, I mean that globalization has made job tenure shorter. It has made it that people move in and out of jobs quicker, and that there has been a growth in things like fixed terms contracts. It's also highly unequal, both within different levels of society, but also with age, with young people experiencing instability at a much higher rate than those who are older. It's also important to note that uncertainty in itself has a temporal aspect. Uncertainty has a backwards-looking aspect, which is shaped by our personal histories. It creates levels of path dependency, and uncertainty that we experience limits our possibilities moving forward. But it is an inherently forward-looking thing, and this idea of the shadow of the future and what we don't know changes how we interact within our life. It's also important to know, while I am particularly looking at employment uncertainty, there is many types of life course uncertainty, whether it be in partnership or in fertility or in housing or education, and that these different life course domains are both competing and complementary. So the hypothesis that I'm working with for my research is that I believe that at least perceived employment stability is a prerequisite life course domain. By that, I specifically mean that that people are looking for a stable employment situation generally before moving on to adding uncertainty in other life course domains like having children and entering parenthood. So the UK situation in particular is defined by a liberal market economy. This means that generally there is less protection for workers. It means that there's high occupational mobility where people move in and out of jobs relatively quickly versus other countries, but also there's higher levels of job displacement. The UK also has less part-time work than some of its low fertility country counterparts, and a lower level of fixed-term contracts. And in general, less people work in the public sector and more people work in the private sector. This high level of job displacement and occupational mobility does not necessarily mean that the UK will suffer from lower fertility outcomes. Other countries that have more employment protection also suffer from things like insider-outsider effect, which means that people have a harder time finding jobs, but it's harder for that employer to lose jobs, creating rigidity in the market. So looking back at what has already been done, this has been a fairly well-studied topic within the realm of fertility. There's been work looking at backwards in previous work experience, including sequence analysis, which I will be using in this research project. And I will be actually using an indicator created by the third article by Busetta, Mendeley, and Vignole from 2 years ago. But there's also been work done on subjective perceptions looking forward. And they have concluded in these separate articles that both backwards and forward-looking measures of uncertainty are important. So this brings me to understanding society and how this fits into my research topic. Because understanding society is a very large panel with now 10 waves, it gives me an opportunity to include both this previous work experience as well as a long-term measure of changes in subjective perception over time. So my research question is, if employment uncertainty has both experienced and prospective temporal aspects, how does experienced joblessness and the perception of future financial and employment instability affect the entry into parenthood? To sum this up, I want to look at how does the backwards experience of joblessness plus perceptions of future joblessness affect our ability to have children. So in my proposed model, I'm using the people who entered the Understanding Society survey in 2009. Those are three groups. It's the British group, the Northern Irish group, plus the ethnic minority boost. I am using all respondents available from wave 1 to 10. My sample starts when people end their formal education. And for the very few people who end formal education before the age of 16, it starts at the age of 16. And people leave my sample upon the birth of their first child. In this case, I have lagged that date by 9 months because I want to particularly look at the employment situation and uncertainty at the month of conception, or when people age out of my sample, which is 45 for women or 50 for men. And that those ages are based on ONS numbers about the number of children people have at different ages. And finally, 1 month after the last available interview. So I have 12,263 respondents in my sample, and that makes for 2,437 events or children. My sample is pretty well representative of the UK in whole, and I have in the appendix, if you want to look up the slides later, the breakdown of my sample. I will be using survival analysis, which I will be looking at the duration of time from the end of formal education until birth of their first child, lagged by 9 months. And I have two main explanatory variables. The first one is the persistent joblessness indicator. And the second one are my subjective perceptions of financial and employment situation. I also have some controls I've added that include age squared education, plus some aspects of life course, which include partnership and employment status of the partner. So first looking at my persistent jobless indicator, this was developed by Mendola, Busetta, and Milotto in 2011. And it's based on this idea of cumulative hardship hypothesis, which is this idea that as people experience more hardship, then they are more likely to have adverse effects later in life. They adapted this in 2019 to look at joblessness, which creates a binary indicator of being jobless or being employed. Their indicator is really useful because it combines 4 key aspects, which is number 1, the number of jobless spells. Number 2, the duration of said jobless spells. Number 3, the proximity of the jobless spells to each other. And finally, they add an alpha for the recentness of the jobless spells, or in this case, to the event that takes place in the observation period. You can see in my 2 graphs that in the first graph to the right, that most people experience continuous joblessness rated as 0, or continuous employment rated as 0. In order to have a better idea of what the variation in my sample looks like, the chart on the right shows the truncated, removing the people who experience continual employment. And we see for the most part, people experienced low levels of joblessness with a peak right near the end with people who experience high levels of joblessness. So the mean for my sample is 0.209. We see that it's fairly close for both men and women in the sample. For people who did not experience a birth within the observation period, it's slightly higher than the mean, But for people who experienced a birth within the observation period, it is significantly lower at 0.108. I'm also using 3 measures of subjective perception. The first one is the perception of present financial situation, which has been coded from a 1 to 5 scale. As you can see, that's not significant changes between the 10 waves observed. And for the most part, with the light color being more positive outlook and the darker colors being more negative outlook, most people in the sample have fairly positive outlooks for the future or for the present. For the future, we see the same type of trend, with the dark color on the bottom being people who view their financial future to be worse off. And again, this stays quite consistent over the waves, with most people having a pretty positive outlook. I also use the subjective perception of job security, which we saw in an earlier talk. And again, I code it as likely, unlikely, and non-employed. And most people in the sample who are employed at the time of questioning, which are in the even waves, believe it is unlikely that they will lose their job in the future, with just a small amount being believing that it is likely they will lose their job in the future. So this brings me to my preliminary findings. These are reported in hazard ratios. So for those who are unfamiliar with hazard ratios, the blue line in the middle there is at 1. 1 symbolizes essentially even odds for an event occurring. So things that happen to the right of the line mean that it's a better than even chance of it occurring. And things that happen to the left of line mean it's worse than even chance of something occurring. First, looking at my backwards looking persistent joblessness index, we can see for men in blue that they have a very strong negative effect on entry into parenthood when they've experienced joblessness. This is similar to other findings previously. But for women, the answer is much more ambiguous, with even though we see a stronger thing or a stronger chance of entering parenthood, it is not statistically significant. My preliminary findings show that my 3 perceptions of subjective measures are relatively ambiguous. I will, in the conclusion, talk a little bit more about the future of this. And finally, I added in some controls because I wanted to look at this within the nested world of partnership. And we still see that while employment is very significant in and of itself, when we include partnership into the sample, partnership and marriage and cohabitation become extremely important. My reference category here is being single. One interesting thing that we observe is that while cohabitation has a weaker effect than marriage, and marriage has a very strong effect for the likelihood of entering parenthood, it seems that particularly for women, the employment status of their partner has some type of stronger effect on this than it does for men. So leading to my preliminary conclusions, we can see that the previous joblessness negatively affects the transition to parenthood, particularly for men. And for women, it remains ambiguous. It might be that there is quite a bit of heterogeneity for women, and that it negatively affects more career-oriented women, while women who are less career-oriented have less effective joblessness, or might experience more joblessness because of their focus on family life. The effect size of my subjective perceptions are relatively small, and that we see partnership is key, and that employment status of the partners, of women's partners, seems to have some strong effect. So these are just some preliminary findings of mine. And unfortunately, I have done some work on these perceptive measures to look at it, and I've interacted them with objective measures of employment status. which seems to have explained some of the ambiguous findings we find. And I hope that I can present this in the future. But also I've had some interesting findings to do with ethnicity and generation. And this will have to be, unfortunately, in a future presentation. If you have any questions, please feel free to contact me.